Hey there, fellow classic comic collectors. As always, I'm Scott Harris King, and today I'm back with another movie review. As I mentioned last time around, I hurt my back recently, kind of laid up for quite a while here. I can't actually be lifting my piles of comics, so what I have been doing is laying around a lot and watching a lot of TV. And one thing that I caught that was really great that I want to talk about is the new Art Spiegelman documentary on PBS. It's called Art Spiegelman Disaster is My Muse. It just came out a few weeks ago on PBS, and I was able to watch it on demand. I've heard that it is only available for a limited time, so I don't know if it's still going to be available when this video comes out. But I just saw it a little while ago, within the last week or so when you're watching this. So hopefully it's still available because it's really excellent. So Art Spiegelman, of course, is famous for doing Mouse. This documentary covers the breadth of his entire career, and there's some really great stuff in there. A lot of really interesting stuff. I'm far from an expert on the underground comics, and I didn't really know that much about Art Spiegelman's other work or other aspects of his career. So if you're into comics at all, you should definitely watch it. But specifically, if you're someone that's into the underground comic scene, you're definitely going to want to check this out. It basically covers his upbringing, his childhood, and all the stuff. If you've read Mouse, first of all, if you haven't read Mouse, you should read Mouse. But if you've read Mouse, you know that it has parallel stories. It's about his father's experiences during the Holocaust, and then it's also about him interviewing his father about the Holocaust and trying to turn it into a comic book. So there's a meta aspect to it, and that whole section of the book is really about his relationship with his father and trying to come to the whole experience is really him trying to understand his father. So there's quite a lot about his parents, about his mother's death, and things like that. Stuff that again is talked about in Mouse. And then there's some great stuff about the underground comic scene. It talks at length about how he got into underground comics, and it's interviews with a bunch of underground comics legends, several of whom unfortunately have passed away since this movie, while this movie was being made. So there's interviews in this with Trina Robbins and with Aileen Kaminsky Crumb. There's also interviews with other contemporaries from the underground comic scene, like Bill Griffith, a bunch of people. And of course, Art Spiegelman himself talks at length about getting into underground comics, creating his first underground comics, and things like that. And it's a real eye opener for me. They talk about influences. Like one big thing that I didn't know about was the first appearance of Mouse. So most people are familiar with the graphic novel, which I think came out in 1986, if I'm remembering correctly. And the first volume did. Some people are not aware that that is a collection of chapters that were serialized as he was making them. They were serialized in the pages of Raw magazine, which his wife was the publisher and editor of. And that started in 1980. I knew that, but I've seen people online that don't know that. I've seen people very confidently say that it never appeared before the graphic novel. What I didn't realize is that Mouse actually predated, before he started working on it as this sort of graphic novel, when he had the original idea of depicting the Holocaust in this sort of funny animal sort of way, with the mice and the representing the Jewish people and the cats being the Nazis, was many years earlier. In 1972, there was a 3-page Mouse story that appeared in an underground comic called Funny Aminals, and I had no idea about that. Again, I'm not an underground comics expert, but the more I sort of get into the history of the underground movement, the more interesting it becomes to me. And so this was super interesting. There was some things they talked about here, and some people. They talked about the importance of another big seminal sort of underground comics work called The Binky Brown Meets the Holy Virgin Mary by Justin Green, which also came out in 1972, and how important that was for the sort of inception of autobiographical comics where people are telling sort of their stories in comics, and how inspiring that was to like a whole generation of people, including Art Spiegelman, and sort of like a foundational work that's led to things like Persepolis, which wouldn't have happened if Mouse hadn't come out and stuff like that. And so it was really fascinating to hear them talk about all this stuff, and definitely makes me want to get some of these key underground comics things because of how important they really were for the development of the medium. I've always been someone in the past that I've been less interested or not interested really much at all in a lot of underground comic stuff because so much of it is or seems to be tied to sort of the underground hippie sort of drug culture stuff from the late 60s and early 70s. So there's a lot of like pot humor and drug humor and stuff like that, which makes sense given the origins of underground comics, and also, you know, they were distributed in the head shops and stuff like that. But I really don't like any kind of pot humor, stoner humor, and all that drug culture stuff. I find it super irritating. And so I've sort of shied away from looking at most of those underground comics because the few bits I have had a lot of that sort of thing, and I have just basically no patience for that. But the more I see some of the seminal sort of works that helped shape how comics were made and thought of, and I'm becoming more and more interested in it. You know, I saw a copy not that long ago, earlier this year, of Binky Brown at a comic store, and I thought about getting it, but it was $30, and I passed on it, and now I'm kind of like, well, $30 is pretty much going rate for that. So I don't know. I'm gonna see if I can find it at some point for a bit of a deal. But some of these key books like that, and Funny Aminals #1, and like Air Pirate Funnies, things like that. I want to get some of these that are really important to the development of comic books as a medium in the United States. Um, and so it was really fascinating to hear them talk about this. Didn't know anything about Art Spiegelman's wife, and I wish there was actually more in the documentary about her and her contributions. It was fascinating to me that, you know, she basically sort of set up a printing press in their house and taught herself how to print stuff, and then decided to do this magazine as sort of a place to a more sort of highbrow thing. So like an overground is so it could take these sort of groundbreaking works that were pushing the boundaries of what the genre was, and put it in a, instead of having it being in these seedy, you know, underground shops, put it in sort of the prestige sort of art market, and how important that was. And you know, then she ends up becoming like the art director eventually of the New Yorker, and bringing Art Spiegelman in to do New Yorker covers and stuff like that. They talk some about that in the documentary about his stint doing these covers in the late 90s. It's very interesting. I wish there, but again, I almost wish there was a documentary about his wife because I was really fascinated by a lot of that stuff. One thing that was super fascinating to me, and I knew just a little bit about this, but again, Art Spiegelman is so Mouse is such a big thing, and he's so associated with that thing that it's hard to think of him, for people that are coming to him just knowing about Mouse, hard to think of him as a creator of other things, but particularly things that are diametrically opposed in feel to Mouse, which is super serious and important. But it was really fascinating to hear about his other job that sort of paid the bills, which was working at Tops. I knew that he was actually the creator of the wacky packages in the 70s, which is these cards and stickers that were parodies of popular brands, right? So I did know that, but they talk quite a bit in the documentary about working for Tops and how he recognized on the backs of like Topps baseball cards that the art for those was being done by one of the former EC horror artists, because he was such a big EC fan and Mad Magazine fan that he recognized the art style on the baseball cards. And he ended up, while he was in high school, going to Topps and talking to the art director there, and he showed the art director's artwork, and the art director was impressed enough so that he wrote a note to himself to call Art Spiegelman as soon as he graduated high school, and he did. As soon as Art Spiegelman graduated high school, the guy from Topps called him and offered him a job at Topps. And he took the job over the summer, but he wanted to go to college and blah, blah, blah. But basically what happened was, for the next 20 years, Art Spiegelman was working at Topps, doing things like wacky packages, which became a huge hit. And so he was basically working there as sort of like a part-time freelancer and making enough money from the success of the stuff at Topps so that he could then spend, 13 years of his life basically working on something like Mouse. So having that commercial outlet where he could make money was basically funding his creative work and his personal work. That's something I think all of us that are creators are totally familiar with, right? There's lots of people who sort of do that, but there's also people that sort of look down on that, where they're like, well, I want to make it as a comic book creator, and I want to be a full-time comic creator. They don't want to be looked at as someone who does a job and then on the side does comics, right? Because, oh, then you're just a hobbyist or whatever. But that's basically what Art Spiegelman was doing for decades, was making his money working at Topps and then doing these indie comics and these underground comics that weren't necessarily making him any money, certainly not enough to live off of. But he was building this, thing that would become Mouse. And he didn't leave Topps until Mouse was published and then became big enough where it was able, I think, to become, they didn't quite say this explicitly, but the timing just makes sense. That came out in 86. It ended up being a bestseller, an acclaimed bestseller. And in 86 is when he left Topps. And then, he spent the next 5 years working on the second volume of Mouse. So, for 20 years, he was paying the bills at Topps. So that was very interesting to me, again, as someone who, I make comics at night after I've been working during the day, and as a freelance writer, like that's how it goes. So it was really interesting to see the sort of nuts and bolts. Bill Griffith talked about how, like, all these people like him, they were all starving artists trying to figure out how are they going to make money, and they were like, somehow Art Spiegelman always seems to have money. And then eventually he brought in Bill Griffith to work on wacky packages with him. So that was really interesting. But then here's the thing I didn't know about his stint at Topps, is that he created the Garbage Pail Kids. Now, here's where, like, I started saying this earlier, but like, here's Mouse, and here's the Garbage Pail Kids. And the Garbage Pail Kids came out in 85. Mouse came out, the collected version of volume 1 of Mouse came out in 86. So he's working on those two things at the same time. So they didn't get into the origin of it too much, but I've looked a little bit online, and basically it seems as though the Garbage Pail Kids originated from wacky packages. I'm extrapolating some from what I read, but it seems as though one of the things he did was he did a Garbage Pail Kid, which was his Wacky Packages version of Cabbage Patch Kids. And when the people at top saw it, some editor there had a big light bulb moment and was like, wait a minute, this is too good. Cabbage Patch Kids is such a big phenomenon that this is something that's such a good idea. We can do a whole line of these. And then they brought in other people and they developed the idea from his original one thing. He was one of the creative directors of the original line, and someone else drew them all. So they brought in a different artist, but he was the original creator of the concept, and then helped come up with all the different whatever. So it's just so fascinating to again to think about when you think about Art Spiegelman, you think mouse. You don't think Garbage Pail Kids, and you definitely don't think of them as being at the same time from the same guy, but they were. And that's really interesting to me as a creator. Um, a lot of the documentary is about how big Mouse is and how much it looms over him and how he feels for a long, long time has felt sort of stuck under it. You know, he was still fairly young when he finished it. In 91, he would have only been whatever in his 40s. And so feeling like he's got this like uh this big weight, um and when the first volume came out he would have only been whatever around 40. So doing it so young, everyone always asks him about Mouse, and then he has sort of like struggled to find something to do after Mouse that's as fulfilling or as big or as important, or just like it's that sort of like you know what for like music and books they called like the sophomore slump. He's struggling to deal with that. And then the documentary also gets into stuff much more recently from the last like 8 years 9 years or so about Mouse being banned from by libraries and stuff like that in certain parts of the country. And it's taken on this whole second life where he's have to become like a sort of free speech advocate, um, and sort of symbol of all of that. So it's really fascinating, great documentary. So A+ for me. I think anyone that's interested in the medium should watch it because it makes a very compelling case, for what a singular genius that Art Spiegelman is in comics. And it was just fascinating. And I'm really looking forward to digging in really more into the underground stuff, because the more I sort of understand how important the underground comics were to sort of changing what comics in America are as a form, the more I want to get those issues and sort of see it for myself. So, really great. Definitely recommend it. If you've seen it or you haven't seen it or whatever, let me know your thoughts down below. I'll see you next time.